The Planner. Every year, my mother and father have a night that they set aside. On that night, they get dressed and pick a restaurant. Then they will be gone for hours, or at least more of the night. This is to mark their wedding anniversary, and they get to enjoy each other on the journey far away from me. And it was on one of these anniversaries, at 2015, that this event took place in. I was about 17 at the time, and I'd been so excited for when they leave because I was intending on sleeping out after them and running to my girlfriend's home. Her parents weren't weird, and they didn't mind me hanging over, unlike my parents did. So I stood at the door and gave my parents their umbrellas, their keys, and everything they needed. They thanked me and asked, wasn't I a bit too excited this year? I said yes. Now I get to sleep in their bed. And they told me that I should be off when they get back. But they left without suspecting anything. I was free to do as I saw fit. I left 5 minutes after they were gone, and I met my girlfriend down by the park. We headed over to her room, and I spent the whole night there, and next thing I knew, it was around 11:30. I had to run back home. I ran back to my home, and as I was running through the streets, my dog ran up to me, barking. And that's when I thought I was going to be in so much trouble. I'd closed the gate back home, and the only way for Maxie to be out was if somebody had opened the gates from my house. I opened my phone, but strangely enough, I didn't see a lot of missed calls or the likes. Shrugging, I walked to my home, and indeed, the gate was open wide. But to make things worse, the lights at my home were turned on. I knew for a fact that I left them turned off, so that I could have pretended to be sleeping. And just then, a shadow walked across the curtains, confirming my worst suspicion. There was somebody in my home. Seeing that, I honestly didn't know what to do, and so I just sat outside the house and watched to see what the guy would do. Moments later, my parents arrived in their car. I ran to the car and I stopped them. My mother asked me what I was doing outside, and I told them everything, except that I had gone out. My father came out and went to stand over the fence. He watched through the window, and when he was content, he pulled out his phone, and he called the cops. The cops arrived in 5 minutes, and the guy inside was arrested. The cops said it was a good thing I ran out. The guy was found hiding in my wardrobe. The Bubba. It was a warm sunny day, and I was bobbing and weaving while carrying my bag on my back. It was a long and tedious road back home, and I was in such a hurry to get back in the house and fall asleep. I don't know why, but my father didn't go pick me up at school, and so my friend at school had volunteered to drive me home with his parents. Problem was, we arrived at their home first, and they were taking so long that I realized it would have been better to just walk home. And so there I was walking home, and I felt so happy when I was finally walking on the walkway of my home and heading to the door. The car was missing, meaning there was probably nobody else who was at my home. And that was when I heard it, the sound that a lot of plates make when you put them down. It came from somewhere in the living room, I could tell. I paused and wondered if there was anybody home, but that was impossible. My mother was dropped off at work before I was taken to school, and my father came back with the car. So if there was no car, it meant my father was gone too. So I realized that whoever was at home was probably somebody who wasn't from my home. However, being a child, I refused to believe this completely. I walked over to the door and I gave the door a tender knock. The clattering sound inside the house immediately stopped, and there was silence. I stood there and waited such a long time that I began to wonder if I'd heard the noise at all. And so, I slowly leaned and peeked in the keyhole. My eye connected with a green eye. The person attempted to open the door, but I turned and ran away from there. I ran all the way to my school friend's house, and when I got there, I told them what had happened. They helped me call my parents, and my parents arrived to pick me up. And when we went back to the house, the guy was long gone, but there had definitely been somebody inside the house, seeing all the mess that they left in the house. The Yeller. A man broke into my home when I was younger and ate my yogurt. This story happened over the course of a couple of days back in 2018. At the time, I was about 12 years old and I was going to turn 13 that April, so I was pretty young. I remember it started one morning when my father came into the house holding up a chunk of wood. He asked which of us broke the wood, but seeing as my siblings and I have never admitted to any crime, we denied everything and there was no way to know who did it. I just knew that it hadn't been me. My father was furious, but not enough to do anything. After all, he wouldn't tell from where the piece of wood was from, since the picket was still fairly intact. A few days passed after that, and I forgot about the wooden piece. At the time, I was in my room when I heard our cat snarling. He was snarling louder than I'd ever heard him snarl in my life, and I knew something was wrong. I ran out the door and into the kitchen, and there I caught my cat running around in circles and hissing at me, which was odd. He'd never hissed at me before, though he didn't like my brother. I got him to relax and started patting him. Then he was silent. But that struck me though. Why did he hate me all of a sudden? Unfortunately, I would get my answer soon. A few days later, I was going to be staying in since I was feeling sick, and the rest of my family were going to leave. That was the plan at least. But as I was sitting on the couch and stuffing my nose with the tissues, the door started turning. I stared at it, not really believing what I was seeing, but it was turning. Finally, it clicked and swung open, and my brother got in. I was so relieved, and I tried to tell him how he scared me, but he lifted his hand, and that was when I saw the look on his face. He looked confused and scared at the same time, and he looked at the ceiling. I couldn't find what would make my brother so scared on the ceiling, but I did start feeling scared myself. I remained quiet as my brother walked around the lounge room, peeking behind the curtains and under the table. He put his car keys down and went to the wall, placing his ears against it. I walked up to him and whispered, "What is the problem?" His ears stayed on the wall, and his eyes moved to me. He asked if I remembered the wood from my father, and I said yes. He said that was a piece of... But before he could finish, his eyes widened and he leaned back, fear completely spreading his face now. He asked if I could hear that. I listened to the wall, not knowing what to expect, but after a minute, I couldn't hear a thing. He listened too and realized that there was nothing. I joked that he just didn't want to go to school, and he laughed louder than the joke was actually funny. He smiled and said, "Yeah, he was just making stupid connections." But then there was a loud thud sound, like somebody just fell down from the stairs. That's why my brother and I got scared. He pulled me along and we hurried to the doors. When at the main door, we could peek into the kitchen, and that's where we saw a man opening the microwave and eating my yogurt. He was wearing a moldy gown and his skin looked shriveled. I couldn't hold back my scream, and he looked up to me, not looking surprised or any emotion. He went back to the microwave, and my brother and I ran out the door. We called our parents and told them everything, and they said we should call the cops. My brother had been hearing the noises in the house, and finally, he had realized that day that the piece of wood had actually come from the decorations on the side of the house. The creepiest part is, it was right under my window. The hiders. Maybe the story is not fit for the home invasion category, because this didn't happen in my house, but it did happen in the house I was in at the time. So at the time I was still in high school and we had an essay to write in English. We were given a question to work on as a duo and my partner was with this other girl from my class. I'll call her Spears, from Brittany. So the day of the essay arrived and I headed over to Spears' house. As I was walking to her home, I couldn't help but notice this SUV parked by the street. It was completely black and massive. As I was walking past it, I tried to peer into its windows, testing the tint. But then as I looked at it, I saw many eyes looking at me. I stumbled and quickly hurried off. At that point, I was sure I'd humiliated myself, and they were laughing. But instead, when I glanced back, I saw that the guys were watching me with stoic faces. I arrived in Spears' home, and I sat on the couch. Her parents were gone by then, so they missed the cake I'd brought them. Spears was in her room, waking up, and she told me to put it on the counter. And as I was sitting on the couch, she told me I could go up to her room, since it was warmer there. Keep in mind, I am not actually seeing her. She's shouting at me from upstairs. I only saw her when I opened the doors to her room. She was wearing socks that reached her thighs with a pink tank top and blue shorts. Surprisingly, it gave me a big one. I tried to hide it as we discussed the essay on her table. But it was really tough. In all the time I'd known Spears, I'd never realized she was actually a girl. And so it felt strange for me to be thinking about her in that way. And I tried to suppress it. And she would take the book to herself, and so I had to walk up to her and read what I wanted to from over her shoulder. I don't know when, but at some point, I completely lost control. She just smelled like lavenders, and so she turned to look at me, and I held her face and I kissed her. Don't bother. I know more than you ever could what a terrible mistake that had been. At first I didn't realize what I was doing, but after I did, I panicked. I pulled away and I quickly read on what I was reading. Her lips were flushed red, and she was stunned quiet for a moment. But finally, she read on with me. Suffice to say, I didn't do any more work after that. I think Spears felt the same way, because she suggested we move to the living room. It was colder there, and so I was glad I'd get to cool down. Even better, she was wearing a gown when we got there. But even then, we couldn't get anything done. Finally, she said we need to talk about what had just happened. And so we did. I told her the truth. I never thought of her like that. But now all I thought about was her. And it was an accident. And she said okay, and asked I don't repeat it. And so we went back to work. I felt a lot better, and I was putting my essay body plan together. She asked me to help with hers, and I asked where she was getting lost. And she kissed me. It was not a real kiss, it was a peck, the one you give your mother, and I'd still been speaking, so she barely touched my lower lip. There was a moment after that where we just paused and looked at each other, and I lost it. I kissed her, this time pulling her tightly against me. I lost control again, but I couldn't care less. I wondered how far we were going to go, and when her parents were going to return. And then the door buckled. I turned and stared at it. The door handle was shifting slightly. Her parents were already back. She said that they weren't supposed to be back by now, and I saw her face turning concerned. So I went to the window and I opened it, and there was a man dressed in black with a black beanie on his head looking into the window. I muffled a scream, and the guy screamed and jumped back. He yelled, "There's a guy," to his friends at the door. And just then, the door clicked. Adrenaline fed me at this point. I ran to the door and I swung it open. Then I screamed as loudly as I could. The men there were more than me, but I guess they'd only been expecting Spears, and so they turned and ran away. I slammed the door and locked it. Spears was standing by the window, staring at the man and shaking so violently. I was too, but I tried to hide it. She kept whispering they were coming for me, and I told her that it was fine. They were gone now, and they were. Spears and I went up to my room, talking about what just happened, and not believing what had just occurred. By then, we were in no mood for doing the essay, but as we were speaking, Spears looked out the window, and her face turned white. She said my name and told me that they were back. And sure enough, the guys were standing there, shoving each other and yelling at each other while pointing at the door. Finally, they pulled out their guns and walked to our door. By then, I had no element of surprise, so I called the cops and hurried to hide in the basement. She kept telling me to fight them, and I was trying to explain to her that I was in no mood to die. And so we hid in the closet, but not before I opened the back door, so they would think we ran away. We heard the guy's footsteps across the house. She held on tightly to my arm, but then there was some loud honking, and the guys ran out. The cops arrived literally seconds later, and so that's how Spears and I failed our English essay assignments. The Hugger. This reminds me of that one time somebody broke into our home. I was laying on my bed and trying to read a few comic books. We'd been given work to do, to write about our heroes, and my hero was going to be a comic book hero. So there I was, reading about comic book heroes, but at the same time, I felt like I really had to go to the toilet. Finally, after finishing about a page and a half, I put my work down and I went to the toilet. I sat there and started doing my business, but then I heard rumbling coming from the other side of the door. At first I thought it was my mother, and I asked her to stop making so much noise. And so the noise immediately came to a stop. Then she grabbed the door and slowly tried to open it. I'd locked it. I asked her what the heck was she trying to do exactly. My mother then called me and asked what I was talking about, and she was calling me from her room. I looked at the door to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. And yes, the door really was trying to open itself. There was definitely somebody out there. I was about to scream when I heard a loud shriek. It was my mother. She asked, "Who the hell are you?" and yelled, "Get out of my house." She yelled it over and over again, and I heard footsteps running away. That's when I tried the door, and my mother pushed it open and hugged me, crying like a baby. Of course, I hugged her back. We called the cops, but by then it was too late. I'm just glad that I had the hindsight to actually lock the door for once.